Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're going to unpack something fundamental. What actually makes an act a crime? We're talking about the core code that legal systems use to draw that line between a tragic mistake and a punishable offense. And believe it or not, it all boils down to a couple of key principles that have been around for ages.
All right, here's what we've got on tap. We'll kick things off by asking what makes an act a crime in the first place. Then we'll get into the two main ingredients, the guilty act and the guilty mind. After that, we'll see how this all plays out in India's huge new criminal code. And to wrap it all up, we'll look at those weird cases where you can have a crime without a guilty mind.
Okay, let's jump right in. What actually is a crime? It's the big question behind our whole justice system.
Think about it like this. What's the real difference between a tragic accident and something you can be punished for? The answer to that question is really at the heart of a legal principle that's been shaping law for centuries.
And that principle is summed up in this little Latin phrase.
I know. Latin can seem intimidating, but stick with me here. This is basically the secret code of criminal law. It's the key that unlocks everything.
So what does it mean? Pretty simple, actually. It translates to an act doesn't make someone guilty unless their mind is also guilty. So for something to be a crime, you generally need two things: a guilty act and a guilty mind. Get it? You need both.
All right, so let's tackle that first piece of the puzzle, the guilty act itself. This is the what you did part. And the fancy legal term for it is actus reus.
So actus reus is just the physical part of a crime. It's the actual conduct, the action, or as we'll see, the inaction that the law says, nope, you can't do that. It's the thing that actually happened.
And here's a really important point. A guilty act can come in two flavors. First, there's commission. That's when you actively do something wrong, like an assault or a theft. But then there's omission, which is when you failed to do something you were legally supposed to do. A classic example is a caregiver who doesn't feed an infant in their care. The law sees both of these as a potential guilty act.
Okay, that's the what you did part covered. But that's only half the equation, right? Now we've got to get into the other, and honestly, the more complicated part, what you were thinking. This is the mens rea, or the guilty mind.
Mens rea is all about your state of mind. It's the part of the law that says, hey, just doing the bad thing usually isn't enough. You have to have a legally blameworthy state of mind while you're doing it. It's the difference between accidentally tripping and knocking someone over versus deliberately shoving them, right? Same result, totally different mindset.
Now, what's really interesting is that the law doesn't just see guilty mind as one single thing. It's more like a spectrum. At the top, you've got intention. This is when you absolutely meant for a specific thing to happen. Then there's knowledge, where maybe you didn't want the outcome, but you were pretty darn sure it was going to happen. And then you have reason to believe, which is basically having enough info that you should have known what might happen. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up. The difference between intention and motive. They are not the same thing in the eyes of the law. Your intention is the immediate goal, the means to an end. But your motive is the reason behind it all, the end goal itself. And here's the kicker. The law really only cares about your intention. A good motive, like say stealing to feed your family, doesn't just magically erase a guilty intention to steal.
So, okay, these principles have been around forever, but how are they being applied in the modern world? Well, we've got a perfect case study. The massive overhaul of India's criminal laws. This is where timeless principles meet modern lawmaking.
And just to give you a sense of scale for this change, just look at this timeline. The old law, the Indian Penal Code, was set up way back in 1860, during British rule. It stuck around for over 160 years as the main criminal code. Then, boom, 2023 arrives and it's repealed and replaced with something entirely new, the Bharatiya Nyaya Sanhita. Yeah, let that sink in for a moment. 163 years. For that long, a single code governed criminal law in India. To replace that, that's a historic legal event, no two ways about it.
And this is way more than just a fresh coat of paint. The new code, the BNS, is bringing in some major changes. You've got totally new things like community service for smaller offenses. It's defining new crimes to tackle modern issues, things like mob lynching and organized crime. And it's also getting rid of old stuff, like the colonial-era law on sedition. It's a real shift.
So, we've hammered this home, right?
Guilty act plus a guilty mind equals a crime. But what about when it doesn't? Let's get into the big exception to the rule.
This is a concept called strict liability, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a standard where you can be found guilty of something even if you didn't have a guilty mind. Your intent doesn't matter. Just doing the act itself is enough. Sounds a bit intense, right? But there's a really important reason for it.
You usually see strict liability pop up in laws that are all about public welfare. Think about things like food safety acts, factory regulations for worker safety, or even public nuisance laws. The thinking behind it is pretty clear. In these areas, the risk of harm to the public is just too high. So the law puts the responsibility squarely on the person in charge to make sure the rules are followed, period. No excuses about not meaning to.
So what's the big takeaway here? That fine line between an accident and a crime. It's not drawn by chance. It's defined by these core legal ideas of a physical act and a mental state. But, and this is the important part, that line isn't set in stone. As our society changes, our laws have to change too, which leaves us with a pretty big question to think about. How should our laws continue to evolve and define what a guilty mind really is?